Hi, I'm Phillip Street with the University of Nevada-Reno. I wanted to thank you for taking the time out of your day to watch this virtual presentation. And so this talk is about three herbivores: Greater Sage-grouse, livestock, and feral horses. And during certain stages of their life history, they're all competing for the same resources. So I like to look at a map and the distribution of these animals. So I'm going to start with Greater Sage-grouse. We see that their range covers much of the western United States. And if we put up a map of the public grazing allotments managed by the Bureau of Land Management, we see that these allotments cover almost the entirety of sage-grouse range. Now, additionally, there's horse management areas which contain most of the feral horses in the western United States. And these are these smaller gray polygons. Lastly, I'm going to put up a map of the Great Basin. This area receives similar weather patterns, and we feel like this is where our results are most applicable. So it's important to consider how these animals are managed. For sage-grouse, they're managed by multiple agencies at the federal, local levels, but ultimately the management resides with the state. Livestock are regulated to grazing allotments. It's up to the Bureau of Land Management as well as the permittees, but these animals can be moved around these allotments and they can be taken off and put back on at different times of year. Feral horses, on the other hand, are relatively unmanaged, meaning that they can't be taken off the allotments or moved on and off. And this is due to the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burro Act of 1971. And what our management tools are to remove these animals from the landscape. Once they're removed, they first have to go up for adoption. And if they're not adopted, then the BLM pays to board these horses. This management strategy works as long as the demand for adopting these horses is out there. But what happened in the early 2000s is that demand went way down. And so the BLM, like everybody, has a limited budget. And so if they're paying to board horses, they don't have the money to remove as many horses off the landscape anymore, as we see by this gray line. And as these removals continue to go down, we see the horse population numbers on the landscape increasing. This figure is a little bit dated. In 2019, it was roughly 89,000. Now it's more like 100,000 horses. So this population's continuing to grow and the impacts are being felt across the landscape. It's important to note that almost half of these horses are in Nevada. So that brings me to my study, and we had three main objectives. The first objective is to evaluate if the presence of non-native ungulates is altering the vegetation needed for sage-grouse recruitment. Second, assess if grazing by ungulates is resulting in lower sage-grouse recruitment. And third, evaluate space use of sage-grouse females with broods and identify habitat critical for recruitment. So there's one common thing among all of these three objectives, and that's the word recruitment. When sage-grouse are adults, they're mostly feeding on sagebrush. Horses and livestock are mostly feeding on the herbaceous understory. However, the herbaceous understory becomes really important for sage-grouse chicks. This hypothesis was first put forth by Beck and Mitchell in 2002, and despite being out there for 18 years, there's been no research to confirm these hypotheses. So that's where our research comes into play. And before we can start to test these objectives, it's important to understand the grazing history of our study area. One portion of our study area had livestock removed in the early 90s, and we saw a dramatic recovery of the riparian areas as well as the upland vegetation. Another portion of the study area had livestock removed at the same time, but feral horses were present. And while they were heavily managed, they were still on the landscape. So in 2013 and 2014, these animals were entirely removed from the landscape. The third portion of our study area has grazing by livestock, and in some areas, showing potential impacts. There's also grazing by feral horses on this third study area. So that brings me to our first objective. Do livestock and horses alter the herbaceous vegetation? So to test this, we went out and sampled the landscape a whole bunch of times. Roughly 1/3 of our points were at nest locations, 1/3 were at locations known to be brooding sage-grouse, and the other third were random locations. We also sampled the landscape for feces of horses and cows. And at this point, it's important to look at the spatial distribution of our sampling. So with our vegetation transects, we surveyed our entire study area. With the horse transect, since there were no horses present on this northern portion, Heart Mountain National Wildlife Refuge, we didn't survey the refuge. Similarly, for Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge, this middle polygon, there are no cows present, so we didn't survey Sheldon for cows. I don't have the time to get into the specifics of these models, but we can look at some of the main findings from it. And one result is a map that's both spatially and variable through time. And so the important takeaway is that for livestock in these grazing allotments, we see that animals aren't uniformly distributed across the allotment. They're keying in on certain features of the habitat. Another thing to point out is that this axis goes from 0 to almost 1 feces per meter squared. Whereas if we look at horses, we see a very similar pattern. It's not the same through time, and it's not the same through space. So within these horse management areas, horses are keying in on certain features. It's also worth pointing out that there's much less horse feces on the landscape, and this axis goes from 0 to 0.22 feces per meter squared. We went out and we sampled the vegetation on the landscape, and we broke it down into 5 categories. Key forbs are forbs that we know these sage-grouse chicks are eating. We can see them foraging on a crepus species. Other forbs, the components of how they help sage-grouse aren't quite as clear. Perennial grasses, which have been good for sage-grouse nest success, bare ground, and lastly, cheatgrass. And so, oh no. Here. So I've color-coded this graph to be green is good, key forbs, perennial grasses, yellow, other forbs, we don't have as well of an understanding, purple, annual grass, because it turns, cheatgrass turns purple when it dries up, and bare ground. And so what we see in these 3 figures is that at all of our random nesting and brooding sites, when cattle are present, these components go down and we get more bare ground. When we're on the landscape, we see this. This is an area where we're predicting high numbers of cattle. This is a cattle exclosure. Inside the exclosure, you see a lush herbaceous understory. Outside the exclosure, it's almost gone. With horses, we see a different story. At our available sites, we see a similar pattern. But when we go to sites that sage-grouse are choosing to nest or brood their young, we see that the plots are transitioning almost entirely to cheatgrass. And on the landscape, when we see horses, we see this is often the case. So in summary, whether the effects are by horses or livestock, the end result are habitat that's less than ideal for sage-grouse reproduction. So that brings me to our second objective. Is grazing by ungulates resulting in lower sage-grouse recruitment? Recruitment for sage-grouse is broken down into 2 main categories: nesting and early brood rearing, after which sage-grouse survive at pretty high rates. Rather than going into the specifics of what we did for nesting, I'm just going to get to a spoiler alert and say that we found no effect. Um, there's other research out there that's come out recently that's shown similar results. However, when these nests hatch, we have these young sage-grouse on the landscape, and we wanted to control for other factors that might be affecting their survival, such as weather or precipitation. And what we found is that in this area in the red, these are birds that are of young age that are getting either rained or snowed on, and that they don't survive as well. However, that effect on survival goes away as the chicks get older. We also modeled additional variation among years and study areas that wasn't attributed to weather, and we found that yearly fluctuations were highly variable. So after we've accounted for these factors, we can now ask, is grazing affecting sage-grouse chick survival? And what we found is that daily chick survival goes down as our index of horse abundance goes up. We see a similar result for daily chick survival. So how do we manage for it? And that brings me to my third objective. We wanted to evaluate the space use of sage-grouse females with broods and identify habitat critical for recruitment. And so we built a model, and the end result, again, was another map. It was based off of the leks we trapped. These gray points are actual sage-grouse locations, and we broke it down into early brood rearing and late brood rearing because birds, the landscape dries up, and after it dries up, the birds have to move to an area with more moisture-rich refuge. Despite these two categories, we can quantify it into low quality, medium quality, or high quality habitat. And what we see is that this high quality habitat, whether it's early brood rearing or late brood rearing, is less than 6% of the available habitat to the birds. So this is a relatively small portion of the landscape to direct management. So our final conclusions are that we modeled an index of horse and cow abundance. We showed that this is resulting in lower vegetation characteristics. This is then in return resulting in lower chick survival, and we model where these birds are on the landscape so we can direct management. And with that, I would like to thank my funding agencies. I just wanted to say that any questions can be sent to me directly at this email address. Thank you for taking the time to watch my talk.